Hanna is, first of all, a new selected member of AGIA, the Arab-German Young Academy of Sciences and Humanities. So after the 20th time, you can really say it. I practiced this a lot during these conference days. And Hanna is a professor of political science with a special focus on radicalization and violence research at Goethe University Frankfurt. And she will chair our first thematic session of day 2, different perspectives on climate justice. So Hanna, I would like to hand over to you so that you can start our session 1 of day 2 of the Interconnected Voices conference.
Well, thank you so much, Philip, and good morning to everyone. I'm really extremely happy to chair this first thematic session of the second day of the conference. I have to say my own work on climate questions and climate justice is already far in the past. So I really appreciate the opportunity to sort of get back into these debates, and I'm looking forward very much to the great panel we're going to have now. So let me introduce our 3 speakers that we're going to hear from today. So the first presentation, Protecting Nature for the Future Generations, Indigenous Peoples and Climate Justice, is going to be brought to us by Joan Carling. And she represents the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development. And the IPMG is a forum for coordination and planning to promote the advocacy agenda of Indigenous peoples, in particular, to enable full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in the development, implementation, monitoring, and review process of action plans and programs on sustainable development on all levels. Warm welcome to Joanne. Our second speaker, Carolin Schuster, is a doctoral candidate at the Bavarian School of Public Policy at the Technical University in Munich. She holds a scholarship from the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and in her research, she analyzes climate change discourses in the online sphere using techniques of machine learning. She's gonna present a talk called Counterframes of Climate Change. Warm welcome to you too, Carolin. And finally, I warmly welcome Mihir Sharma to the panel. He's a junior fellow at the Bayreuth International Graduate School for African Studies. His research focuses, among others, on social movements, race and anti-racism, as well as environmentalism. He is an anthropologist by training, and I find most interestingly, he holds an MA in medical anthropology. He will give the third paper on Whose Crisis? Some questions from social movements. Now, before I give the floor to Joanne, I would like to tell all of you that you got around 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes for your presentation. I will try to give a sign once you approach the end of your talk. And I will then allow some time for direct questions after your talk, after each presentation. But I would kindly like to ask the audience to keep their points of discussion maybe for the end of this session, so that we only have direct questions after each talk, and then maybe combine the questions in the final session. We should then have enough time for this. We have 1 hour, but I heard it would be fine to also give ourselves 5 minutes more if needed. So if you have a question or comment, please do use the chat, the Q&A chat that is available to you. Simply type your question. And yeah, now I'm happy to give the floor to Joanne. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you for giving the IPMG the space to interact with a lot of the young people who are our future, if I may say. So let me share the perspective of Indigenous peoples with regards to climate justice. Around 5 years ago, an indigenous village in Cambodia near the river were doing a series of rituals to appease their ancestors because they thought the reason for the flooding of their land was their lack of paying respect to their ancestors and to nature, only to learn later that the large hydro dams in Vietnam in the upstream of the river was releasing water and causing the flooding of their lands. In Brazil, the customary forest protected by indigenous
Joanne, sorry, I think you accidentally muted yourself. Could you?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, should I start again?
Well, we heard you. If you just could repeat maybe the last minute you talked.
Yeah. Okay, so in the example that I was saying on the Cambodia, they learned later that the cause of the flooding of their land was the release of water from Vietnam in the upstream of the river. In Brazil, the customary forest protected by indigenous communities in the Amazon is being burned down by ranchers for expansion of their ranches. In Africa, the Maasai are in desperate situation because their cows and herd of animals are dying because of severe drought, but are not getting any kind of support. In Ecuador, they are demanding the rehabilitation of their lands and resources destroyed by oil spills. In Norway, the Sami people are opposing the windmill farms as this will severely affect their reindeer herding areas, which is part of their culture and livelihood. In the US, Native Americans are defending their lands, rivers, and resources from tar sand mining. In Siberia, Russia, indigenous peoples are raising their concern on the unsustainable nickel mining for electric cars of Tesla. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the indigenous peoples protecting their forest, which is declared as national park, are being evicted as they are regarded as destroyers of the forests. These are the realities of climate justice issues for indigenous peoples across the world. While indigenous peoples have the least carbon footprint due to our simple lifestyles, we are highly vulnerable to climate change. At the same time, while we are protecting and conserving forests and biodiversity, we are evicted in the name of conservation and carbon sequestration. We are even criminalized in practicing our livelihoods. Likewise, while indigenous peoples are fully supporting the just transition for fossil fuels to renewable energy, the implementation of many renewable energy projects are violating our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, to our livelihoods, to our cultures, and to our well-being. This is also the issue of social equity, as energy is not for indigenous communities, but for industries and the urban and semi-urban areas. Let me present an overview on indigenous peoples and why climate justice is at the heart of our survival. The indigenous peoples comprise 6.2% of the global population, but 15% of the poorest. 72% of the more than 476 million indigenous peoples live in rural areas, including in fragile ecosystems, which we have conserved and adapted to for centuries, but are now threatened by climate change. For centuries, indigenous peoples across the globe are living in harmony with nature for our collective survival and well-being and the survival of the future generations. Indigenous peoples continue to conserve more than 50% of the world's remaining biodiversity and enrich our cultural diversity as our contribution to the world. Majority of indigenous peoples persisted in maintaining our strong attachments to our customary lands and resources, which we regard as the source of our distinct identity, spirituality, traditional knowledge, culture, and ways of life. So we are one with our land. With this principle and practice, Indigenous peoples maintain our interdependent and respectful relationship with nature and the environment. The land, the seas, rivers, mountains, forests, savannas, deserts, the sun, the moon, the sky, the wind, the flora and fauna. This relation is further expressed in our social values of cooperation, reciprocity, upholding the common good, do no harm, and to use resources for one's needs and not greed. These social values are important in maintaining community cohesion and resilience, as well as in maintaining peace and conserving resources for the future generations. These values are the foundation and framework of environmental sustainability for Indigenous peoples. The interdependent relationship of Indigenous peoples with our land and resources have persisted in varying degrees in spite of colonization, forced assimilation, and impositions by states which Indigenous peoples have resisted in many ways. The prevailing dominant economic, political, and social systems which disregarded Indigenous peoples' interdependence with our environment have resulted to the systemic discrimination and marginalization of Indigenous peoples. The process of industrialization with the use of technologies for resource extraction, such as wide-scale mining of oil and minerals, have devastated Indigenous territories across the world. Likewise, the building of large dams have severely fragmented the riverine systems and have caused the forced eviction of more than 80 million Indigenous peoples. The massive deforestation and grabbing of lands for wide-scale agribusiness have made Indigenous peoples even more impoverished due to forced eviction, destruction of livelihood, among others. As evidence have shown, the process of industrialization and economic growth being imposed on us by states, corporations, and investors is causing climate change. And for Indigenous peoples, this is synonymous to environment destruction and attacks to our reciprocal relations with nature. It is also the main factor on social inequity and the lack of social justice. This so-called development has resulted to serious pollution of rivers and water from mining toxic waste, dumping of nuclear waste, destruction of forests, resulting to loss of biodiversity, among others, which is also a factor of why we are having the COVID-19 pandemic now. These have profound impacts to Indigenous peoples, not only in relation to our sustainable livelihoods, but also to our cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, well-being, and our overall survival and the survival of the future generation. Thus, the demand for climate justice needs to include the respect and protection of human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples, the need to transform the unsustainable economic system to people-centered development and environment protection, stronger accountability mechanisms for governments, corporations, and business groups, including effective mechanisms for access to justice at different levels, from local, national, regional, and global. For Indigenous peoples, climate justice requires the recognition and protection of our inherent rights to our lands, territories, and resources, and to self-determination, and for the sustainable and equitable use of natural resources. This protection shall provide the enabling environment for Indigenous peoples to continue our practice of living in harmony with nature. This will enhance our conservation of biodiversity, strengthen our resilience, and our contribution to combating climate change and to protection of the environment. While Indigenous peoples claim 60% of the land surface as our customary land, only 10% is legally recognized. The collective rights of Indigenous peoples, including our right to our distinct cultures, are affirmed by the UN Declaration of Indigenous peoples. So it's time for states to abide by their international human rights obligations to Indigenous peoples if we are to achieve climate change. The prevailing criminalization of Indigenous peoples and killings of Indigenous peoples leaders with impunity needs to stop, and access to justice needs to be provided to victims and their families. The eviction of Indigenous peoples from their customary forest and lands for renewable energy projects and other so-called green projects and for conservation without our consent should stop. What we need is to build partnerships with Indigenous peoples as rights holders and as stewards of nature who are providing solutions to climate change. We need to provide an enabling environment for Indigenous youth to learn and practice Indigenous knowledge, principles, and values in living in harmony with nature. We need global solidarity and sustained actions to demand accountability and transform our systems to protect our planet, ensure social equity, non-discrimination, and to live in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for this comprehensive view on Indigenous peoples and pointing out the vulnerabilities, but also maybe pointing to agency and how important that is to include Indigenous peoples in the programs that we develop. So I would now like to ask the audience whether there are any direct questions to Joanne's talk. So far, everyone expresses their gratitude in the chat for this wonderful presentation. And I don't see any direct questions, so maybe we'll come back to that later in the broader discussion. And I would now like to invite Carolin Schuster to give her presentation. Carolin, please switch on your camera and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hanna. Thanks for having me. I hope you can hear me. Okay, great. Sound is working. All right, let me share my screen. So we can get started. So thank you for the introduction, Hanna. To clarify, my research is very interdisciplinary. So I'm researching the digital climate discourse, but I'm doing my doctorate actually not in politics or sociology, but in computer science. And today I will talk to you about counterframes of climate change. I realize that this is the climate justice session of the conference, and I'm going to assume that climate justice is a vital point of view for all of us, a salient framing in our minds. But as you will see, I will make a case that we should keep other perspectives in mind, at least for the communication. So let me start by just reviewing quickly what framing is. So framing, best described by Antman, is selecting some aspects of a perceived reality and constructing messages that highlight connections among them in ways that promote a particular interpretation. Antman further defines framing in terms of what frames do, like defining problems, such as the disaster that climate change can bring about, to make moral judgments, like we have a moral obligation to leave a healthy planet for future generations. This would be the climate justice frame. Or frames can support particular remedies, for example, economic message, such as cap and trade. The data that I have been working with during my research is social media data from especially Facebook, and I've found frames to be an adequate theoretical concept to classify this meaning in social media posts. I have previously worked with the concept of stance. So, for example, does a Facebook post signify belief in climate change or not? But frames can capture much more nuance in the communication that is going on social platforms. So currently I'm working on a project where we want to measure polarization and political communication in the US. So we're annotating Facebook posts by US senators and Congress members. So here we have a good example of a climate justice framing by a congresswoman from California. And just one hint here, as I said, my research is very interdisciplinary and we're actually doing data science. So the end goal actually is that we can have artificial intelligence help us classify those frames. But teaching algorithms like BERT, which is a Google solution, actually powering the Google Translate and other functions, at the moment is very difficult. BERT can recognize these kinds of high-level frames. So we first need to annotate the data ourselves, understand it ourselves, so we can actually teach it to the algorithm. So that just as a side note. And so what I'm showing you next will be based on insights from working with those Facebook posts by US elected officials, by Facebook user comments that I've worked with previously, and existing literature on climate change framing. Having worked on the topic of climate change for some time, I regularly come back to this one citation that I think is a great description of the root of the problem. Because there are two sides to this polarized debate, and where one side's livelihood is severely threatened by a world outside the status quo, severely threatened by climate change. But we must consider that the other side does feel threatened too. It does not matter if this is irrational. We still must consider their fears because there are so many. And climate change is scary, but the changes in society that climate action demands are scary too. And it does not help that so much time has passed and now climate action measures must be more drastic than ever. Of course, this increases the fear. And so those two different sides frame the issue in very divergent ways. Let me start with the framing of science. On the one hand, we have the framing of settled science, emphasizing that the science is clear, that we must listen to the science. And scientists keep on communicating with more and more and still more evidence. But a lack of evidence is not the issue. Because as soon as the evidence became conclusive, like decades ago, an alliance formed of conservative think tanks, also the fossil fuel industry, US government think members, and a handful of scientists that framed the climate science as uncertain anyway, no matter the evidence. And they did so with great success. You know that even left-leaning media such as the New York Times gave disproportionate coverage to just a handful of skeptics. Well, the other approach is to simply denounce the science as junk science and to demonize climate scientists. So while we of course have to keep on talking about evidence and new research, the thing is, skeptic individuals are just going to ignore them because they either are motivated to do so or they simply have no trust in them. If you do not trust the institution of science anymore, you will not trust the results. And of course, this way we can talk more about climate science, but this is not going to turn the polarization into collaboration. Here, as one side note, I did see, and this I think it's becoming more, and this is also what we're trying to find out in our research, is that there are Republicans that actually engage in settled science framing, which of course is a good thing to know, and we hope that will increase. The next thing that is often seen, and I mean, I think we saw it here earlier, is disaster framing. It's a very obvious frame to talk about the disaster that climate change really can be if we don't do anything about it. So it's also in my social media, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. And of course, there is a framing answer, the alarmism frame. It concludes that activists and scientists are completely exaggerating, and if climate change is actually happening, it will not be as bad, or we will have some technological remedy. And what I have seen regularly, not from the US party elites, but like in user comments, mostly US user comments, is that there's a claim that climate change will actually be good because it will foster plant growth. So here we have a real-world example of climate change framed as an opportunity by individuals. But yeah, just like with the science frame, I do not see how this conversation here can ever converge. Getting back to the climate justice framing. In the literature, it's was listed as a morality and ethics frame, but it's safe to say, I would say that activism has claimed this frame and assigned it its proper name, climate justice. And for this, I have not observed a direct answer from the opponents to climate action. They're more referring to the hoax frames, or economic framing to answer to climate justice framing. And economical framing is maybe the most dominant framing theme in all the data that I have seen. And both sides use economics to justify their position, but with very, very different conclusions. On the one side, we have the argument that the economic cost of climate change will be tremendous, and we have to act right now to avoid them. And furthermore, that greener infrastructure also poses an economic opportunity. On the other side, we have the argument that the cost of climate action will be very high, and it's not worth it, because the economy will keep on growing and future generations will be richer and thus be able to handle any costs. If economics do or do not support climate action really depends on what assumptions you make when modeling the future economic developments, especially the so-called discount rate, which discount future economic utility. But this is a research field itself that I'm not going to go into. My point is that economic framing brings both sides as close together as possible in their communications. While there is disagreement about its distribution, there's a common goal of economic welfare. And there's some trust from both sides in the market system and its actors. And it does seem that common ground can be found here. And related to this, there's also conservative value framing. There are Republican elected officials in the US that are speaking out for climate action, despite their top party leaders still calling it a hoax or denying its importance. So here I have an example of the Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, who emphasizes a technological solution as a means to both reduce emissions and improve energy output. And I've seen this by other Republicans who advocate for climate action. The emphasis on market-based solution, innovation, technology. And for example, there's also a movement forming that calls themselves the eco-right, and it's trying to build on this framing. The thing is, they have a very difficult job because they are outside in the mass demanding climate action, because they're regarded as not wanting enough, but they're also outsiders within their own party. In conclusion, while the framing of uncertainty is one of the reasons for decades-long inaction, framing could also be part of the solution. Let me elaborate by coming back on the issue that climate action is seen as a threat to the status quo. I wonder, does it really have to be perceived as that threatening? Conservative value framing could help that climate action is understood as less of a dreadful change that goes against conservative values and more of a continuation of innovation. Furthermore, experiments show that the source of the climate message matters. Republicans trust in Republicans. A conservative framing and thus understanding of climate change can open up communication possibilities and policy space for conservative leaders. It might ease the way out of the skeptic bubble, because if climate action can be conservative, then this would not seem as switching sides, as losing face. And lastly, so you've seen there is some common ground to be found, and I think this should be emphasized as opposed to the political struggle or debate about the fundamentals of science, because this could facilitate political collaboration. Here, like US Senator Brian Schatz has also written in one of his Facebook posts, that we need bipartisan leadership and market-based solutions have support across the ideological spectrum. So while climate justice has become the most salient framing for us, I think politicians, activists, scientists should also consider the perspective of those feeling threatened by climate action, because mitigating climate change will just be easier if we can get even more people on board. So thank you. And here I've included my sources. The slides will be uploaded later in the download section, so you can check out if you want to read more on this. And I actually prepared a discussion question, but I guess we're not really going to have a discussion here. But I will ask questions anyway, because they're interesting. If you have observed any other dominant frames, because this was a very US-centric view, so it's a good question to think about. And a question to think about is also if climate activists should diversify their communications.
Thank you so much, Carolin, for this insight into the framing activities of two groups of powerful speakers, I would say. And indeed, I mean, very interesting that there doesn't seem to be a real counterframe to climate justice framing. And as for your last question, I think Joanne's talk maybe speaks very well to the question, which other framings could there be outside of these powerful US-based speaker groups. So we have two questions in the Q&A. One is for Joanne. I would, if Joanne agrees, I would put that to the end of this session, but there's a direct question for Carolin by Setu. What have your experiences been in communicating these important concepts and frames of thinking to conservative decision makers? Is representations the biggest lever, or can we convince existing structures to change? So maybe you could give a brief answer, Carolin, if possible, because I think these are big questions.
Can I see this question somewhere?
Well,
yeah.
If you click on the Q&A, you should be able to see it. It's under answered questions. I don't know why. I think Zoom understood that you already answered that in your talk, but I mean, this is not Zoom's authority, so please do answer, Carolin.
So actually, I have no experience myself in communicating these important concepts, but more analyzing how these concepts are communicated in social media, and also looking at the reception from social media users. And well, for example, as I said, looking at the political conservative leaders, those that are actually promoting climate change action. What is very interesting is how much hate they get from their own party, from their own comments from their own affiliates in this case. And I think they do it anyway because of they're convinced that this is the right thing to do. But I think that we need to, if we have a more can reach a more critical mass of political conservative leaders supporting climate action, and if it can be more of them, it becomes more normal, and we could really see that support for climate action can increase.
Thank you, Carolin. Now, I just realized that I accidentally thought this question was addressed to you because it seemed to fit so well to your talk. I learned from the general chat that this was a question that emerged in the previous panel, but thank you still. I think actually your answer was very interesting, and this also might point to the bigger questions that sort of go with us through the whole conference or day. So thank you. As I said, I would maybe put the question Louise asked, addressed to Joanne, to the end of this session, to give Mihir the opportunity now to give his talk, and maybe then also discuss these questions with all the panelists. So Mihir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm just going to try and share my screen if that works. Can you see my screen? Okay, thank you so much. I'm just going to try and full screen this. Oops. Okay. Thank you, Agia and RLI, for organizing this brilliant program. Thank you, Dr. Pfeifer, and for moderating. And thank you, Clara, Katrin, Zakia, and Philip for the brilliant organization. I apologize for the limitations of this talk, which has changed a little bit since Clara contacted me, especially because of my tendency to generalize and formulate this talk as an elegy, in German Elegie, for and with climate martyrs. In this talk, I will attempt to center the question, whose crisis, with respect to social movements which are often categorized as climate or environmental justice movements. I don't want to conflate the two so much as to operationalize an entangled and troubled relation between these terms, especially as they are used to forge a notion of newness, so the new climate movements and so on in the global north. Instead of discussing the many utopian lessons and prefigurative practices of social movements and the entanglements between the racial capitalist scene or plantationist scene and the multiple crises of ecology, environment, climate, which has been done brilliantly by many people here and elsewhere, I will ask, how do we and could we relate to those that are not allowed to live? Can we think or even act, or how could we act in solidarity with the already dead and those condemned to die, fighting the same struggle? So we could define this struggle in different ways. And by this, I mean the climate/environmental struggles. Today is the November 26th. It's the National Day of Mourning on Turtle Island, or in colonial language, Thanksgiving in the United States. It is from this call to mourning that I'm trying to feel and think through the presentation. Frederick Jameson famously stated a couple of decades ago that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. The anthropologist David Valentine responded with the question, whose world is being talked about here? Whose apocalypse? In his brilliant book, Nick Estes, Our History is the Future, Indigenous activist and historian as he is for the Lakota, argues that as for most people, Indigenous people on Turtle Island, there have been several apocalypses: mass murders, smallpox, broken treaties, reservation life, massacres, theft of lands, theft of children, extinct languages and futures. As Joan showed earlier, this is also the case for Indigenous people in other parts of the world. If there is anything the new climate movements then, I would urge, can learn from the Lakota, one could extrapolate, it is how to resist extractive, capitalist, settler colonialist expansions in a post-apocalyptic world, such as was the case in the Standing Rock mobilizations against the Dakota Access Pipeline a few years ago. Depending on who you ask, the crises of climate change and its concomitant others originates either with the Industrial Revolution in 1492, or as Carolin pointed out, it's fake news. Andreas Malm has shown in his book how the emergence of fossil capital was, beginning with coal in Britain, largely determined by the desire for the superior control of subordinate labor. Following the Dalit scholar B.R. Ambedkar and his insightful analysis about caste, which is namely, caste is not just a division of labor, it is a division of laborers, one might add that climate politics is entangled increasingly and is also about the superior control of subordinate laborers, beginning with the first multinational extractivist corporations, as Ime showed in her keynote this morning, which is concomitant with the rise of the transatlantic enslavement and colonialism and settler colonialism as processes. Indeed, the global division of laborers is then one of the crucial deadly effects of what the oligarchy of the 1% in what Ramon Grossvogel, the decolonial scholar, has called the modern colonial capitalist patriarchal world system. And this is what it seeks to maintain. Race and racism, one might argue, was a creation of this project of the global division of laborers, among other things, as are necessarily the forms and sites where these racializations are materialized en masse. So for example, in camps, favelas, banlieues, refugee camps, prisons, and so on, and are concomitant with the creation of the plantation and transatlantic slavery, as well as the border regimes that seek to maintain these structures. Some might call this neo-colonialism. Following the scholarship related to the argument in Fossil Capital, it becomes clear that not only do capitalist logics of extraction require a global division of laborers, and therefore a global ordering and subjugation of the dispossessed, the landless, stateless, subjects, and non-citizens of modernity, but since we are also discussing climate justice and social movements, this also means that those protesting this division, standing up against it, or extraction or invasion of lands, as Joan showed earlier, in certain zones, have faced the pits of necropolitics and continue to be condemned to brutal repression. Eronil de Fermi, chief of the Omagua Cambeba in the quote-unquote Brazilian Amazon, asked, "Do I deserve to die for speaking on behalf of people?" What she did in the Amazon region, she says, deserves or can expect only one fate ultimately, which is death. Eronilde says that this is a destiny that she has been avoiding for more than a decade in her capacity as head of the 15 Omagua Gambeba communities. It also explains why there are no photographs of her without a mask in this presentation or in most articles, because she fears reprisals from her opponents, which are both local and international. Her last image, which struck the news cycles, was when she was facing off single-handedly against a tractor invading the indigenous lands. Now, this is by no means, I don't mean to suggest that these battles are only taking place in these arenas. When Karl Marx, the German thinker, was alive, he wrote very eloquently about the first enclosures that were taking place in what is now the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, where people who had treated the forests as commons for collecting logs and firewood were shot at by the police because the forest was now a private enclosure. And Marx wrote very eloquently saying they continued to collect wood for they knew what their punishment was, but they didn't know their crime. I want to think through these observations through two locations in the last part of this presentation, which is, since I'm located in Berlin, Germany, what is my relation? And I use the I and the my as a rhetorical device, so I don't just mean myself, but I mean one. Since I'm located in Berlin, Germany, what is my relation to environmental and climate activists in various zones and regimes? And then secondly, a more theoretical question, if biopolitics is the new form of power over life, how might a focus on necropolitics make particular solidarities incumbent? Necropolitics, in Achille Mbembe's formulation, is conceptualized as the political making of spaces and subjectivities in an in-between of life and death. The colony and the plantation are the sites and forms, along with the camp, as formulated by Agamben, Baumann, and Foucault, of necropolitics. This entails the production of what Mbembe calls death worlds, namely new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjugated to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of the living dead. The so-called climate crisis, according to Mbembe, engenders exactly such a status upon vast majority of the people. If a status is by definition a relation, then I ought to examine my relation to this status of the living dead, and in so doing also expose my locus of enunciation, my positionality from where and for whom and with whom I am speaking. Global Witness reported that a record 212 environmental activists were killed in 2019. Half of the reported killing in 2019 took place in Colombia and the Philippines, with 64 and 43 deaths recorded respectively, with two-thirds of the deaths occurring in Latin America alone. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit Colombia earlier this year, Ernesto Guasiruma and his brother were quarantining at home, fearing rise of infections. They were shot dead in their own home for protecting their lands. Similarly, when Leon Dulce, the Filipino activist, was asked about the safety of himself and others, he says, safety is no longer in the vocabulary of environmental defenders or, activists in general in the Philippines. It is a situation where you will always fear for your life. But then if you're not going to do the work you do, who else will do it? European settler colonialism as a project, as Sylvia Winter, Patrick Wolf, Gerald Horne, and Aimé Césaire, among others, have argued, was from and in its inception a project of both biopolitics and necropolitics. And this is by no means limited to simply European projects. Indeed, settler colonialism is present, for example, by the Indian state in Kashmir, the Chinese state in various parts of the People's Republic, and so on and so on. And Brazil, indeed, as we have seen in the example of indigenous resistance. And so I would urge, however, that examining the aggregates and conglomerates of how oligopolies of power emerge and are sustained in the post-1492 era might give us good targets to focus on as activists and thinkers. It follows then that the allegedly utopian formulations of settler colonialists have necessitated colonizing genocides, as Aimé Césaire formulated. exterminate all the brutes, as the Anglo-Saxon credo went. The resilience, resistance, and ongoing struggles of the post-apocalyptic generations subjected to settler colonial and colonial regimes then on this day of mourning can serve as an anchor for envisioning common futures for the commons. The DARA and Climate Vulnerability Report reveals that climate change is responsible for 400,000 deaths annually, as a very conservative estimate. However, those numbers are counted, with that number jumping to 4.5 million when accounting for deaths associated with various aspects of a globalized, carbon-intensive, extractivist economy. Depending on how we count the victims of climate crises, this figure might be uncomfortably high, although one might ask if numbers of lives lost should be the point at which one becomes uncomfortable. Okay, the last part. Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted, as Joan and others have shown, by the regimes of global necropolitics, politics of death, put briefly, especially if we regard indigeneity as a relation to ongoing settler colonialism, beginning with the brutal process of accumulation of land and the means of production. This talk is in part response to a question one of the participants in a meeting of climate activists in Berlin asked me, which was, why are climate activists killed in Colombia and not in Berlin? We can discuss this question later, but I think this is something I want to rest with as a question. To activists working with Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Ende Gelände around us, around me at least, one could ask, what is your relationship to these protesters on this day of mourning? What are they to you? What would you do to defend the lives of your cousin, of your adopted parent, your companion dog? Donna Haraway has urged us to make kin, and Anat Singh agrees that this practice is essential to the arts of living on a damaged planet. By kin, Haraway means those who have an enduring, mutual, obligatory, non-optional, you can't just cast that away when it gets inconvenient, enduring relatedness that carries consequences. I have a cousin, the cousin has me. I have a dog has me. If that were to be the case, if I were to make kin with the martyrs of the climate movement and the victims of climate change, who are also very often the victims of settler colonialism, it would entangle me in forms of relations, reciprocities, and mutuality that I currently do not hold. So if I were born in a family, province, or nation state of settlers and colonialists, then I must betray this family and make kin with Ernesto Guasiruma, with Eronil de Fermin, with Nimo Base and others. Having reciprocal relations with our environment so we don't destroy it, this is needed for future generations, Joan Carling proposed recently in an interview. So I end with this question. What would kin making mean for, What would kin making mean for reparations, climate reparations, for how we do local politics in the global north? And what would it mean for our politics around borders, flows of capital, weapons manufacturing, and companies like Tesla, which mines lithium in Bolivia, and so on. What would one find if one followed these ethico-political emergencies, and what would the much needed movements, which I greatly admire, around us seek to do? Fridays for whose futures, rebellion against whose extinction, and the Ende of which Gelände? I end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mihir, for this thought-provoking and dense presentation, which I think speaks very well to the talks we've been hearing. And thank you also for connecting it to Joanne's talk and the previous discussion. So I would now like to invite everyone to use the minutes we have left to engage with the talks we've heard. And indeed, we have a question by Louise Wagner addressed to Joanne. Joanne, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to read the question and maybe already thought about an answer. So please, I would like to invite you to give an answer to Louise.
Yes, I agree with you in the way protection is being interpreted in the West. Particularly, it's what we call as the fortress conservation, where the way to protect nature is to just leave them and the people out of it, which is not the way indigenous peoples actually conserve and manage resources. And in fact, data have shown, evidence have shown that biodiversity managed by indigenous peoples are better conserved than those conserved by big conservation organizations and by governments. So that needs really to be addressed, because it's really a big problem for indigenous peoples when we are evicted in our territories. It's absurd that the ones conserving these resources are the ones being evicted and even charged as destroyers of Mother Earth. The second point is on the patenting the biopiracy of traditional knowledge or indigenous people's knowledge. That is really in contrast to the very principle of indigenous peoples, that knowledge is for sharing, for the common good. You don't use knowledge for greed. You don't use knowledge for just promoting your selfish interests. So that's why indigenous peoples have always been sharing their knowledge, because that's the way we can survive, is to share our knowledge, so we can all use it. And that's precisely why we are also having this crisis now, because we're allowing a set of people in the few to control knowledge and use this knowledge to develop their own technology that will further destroy us. So that is the challenge actually that we need to address, and look back to what values do we need to revive and go against this kind of manipulations of knowledge to serve selfish interest. So yeah, thanks for flagging that issue, which is a critical issue related to climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you also for pointing to the power-knowledge nexus that we're facing at the moment, and also what knowledge do we actually consider, and what knowledge counts in the end. I think this is a very important question. I have I guess, more general question to the panel by Pierre-François, who is asking about, I think, two things. The first is to point to the amount of energy. Now he writes again in the general chat, but I'm going to stick to the question he asked first. So energy consumption in the US and Europe, which is far above what could be counted as the world average. And he asks, on the one hand, how could we actually sell decreasing the level of comfort to US and EU populations? And also he wonders whether other countries, other world regions are economically dependent on this level of consumption in the EU and the US. So he wonders whether actually decreasing this level would improve the situation of other world regions, or whether this might not even be the case. I guess this is a question addressed to the panel in general. Maybe some of you, one of you or some of you feel they could give an answer to this. I think,
yeah.
Yes, Joanne, please.
Yeah, I think, yeah, this is actually what also indigenous peoples are saying, that I think the very orientation now of our economy, which is high level consumption, is again in contrast to what indigenous peoples have in terms of simple lifestyle, thereby not needing all this kind of comfort, but precisely because it's those comforts that are generating the profit for the people generating this kind of sudden becomes a need for people to do. So we need to change that in order to when we say we reduce the energy consumption of Europe, and we actually need to review what are the necessary ones and which are the not necessary ones, which are the luxurious ones that you actually don't need. And that will then allow social equity, because in many of indigenous communities, they don't even have energy. And yet they host this energy, all these dams all are built in our land. We don't get the energy. It all goes to these industries and again, to generate profit again. So it's a skewed system where we find this uneven use of energy that is also exacerbating social inequity, because it is driven by a system that drives us to consume so that profits can be generated, instead of developing energy according to meeting the needs of people and sustaining the environment. So we really need to but it's right that the reduction of energy, the use of energy and in relation to many of the energy are actually wasted because they're not efficiently managed. So that should be addressed.
Thank you, Joanne. I mean, maybe asking this question in that way leads us back to Mihir's point about positionality and whether this is the most pressing question to wonder how we could live without the comfort we know, and what it actually means that this is the question we're asking and not other questions. Thank you, Joanne. I think
I would like to quickly add something here.
Yeah, please, Carolin.
So I think what Joanne was meant, and what I think some people are considering, is that we actually need a whole system change. But the problem is that climate change is such an urgent problem that a whole system change, like make a more egalitarian system, we can't achieve this in time. Like, I mean, it's so far away. We don't see it on the horizon that we can hope to have like the system change in time to act on climate change. This is why I'm promoting to appeal to conservatives, to those that really believe in the system, to use the system and make climate action seem like in line with the system. Because I think because of the short-term solutions we have to find, there's unfortunately not another way.
Yeah, Carolin, thank you. I think it's very interesting that what you actually suggested in your talk, and I think now also re-emphasized, is that there is some common ground to be found in the belief of, let's say, the economy, capitalism, and innovation. But at the same time, I would argue, well, aren't we committing the same mistake again to trust in capitalism? And also, I would like to give back the word to Mihir if he wants to answer, because he had this nice quote, the question of when will capitalism die and what kind of deaths will we have faced before that? So maybe just as an open question in the end, can economic solutions really be the solution, despite, as you pointed out, Carolin, the fact that systematic transformations might take too long to actually solve our problems? But Mihir, maybe you want to address some more points.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add maybe one little point, which is that in Europe, there was the framing, as Carolin explained, the concept of framing, the framing of the so-called refugee crisis. And one might ask, whose crisis is the refugee crisis? You know, I mean, is it a crisis of the people who are fleeing from their lands, also because of environmental degradation and climate change, not just because of sort of political conflicts and so on? And if we take that seriously, then I think it seems that the dismantling of the system is already several generations too late for a lot of folks. And what I was trying to urge was to, even though was to think from sort of, or feel from that positionality, or relate to that positionality, if that makes sense, and inform our thought and action from this urgent space. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We're well, almost on time, I would say. We started a bit late, and I really have to say these were 3 very different talks, but all of them extremely inspiring. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to chair this session, and I definitely want to follow up on all of your work. And Philip lets me know that he has some announcement before we go into the break. And for me, this means that my role is over now. And I'm once more, thank you to the three panelists, but also to the audience and their engagement with the discussion. And I now give back to Philip.
Yes, thank you. And please, everyone, stay on the panel, because I think this is I want to shine in your light. Because this was just an incredible, interesting session, and I think it's fits so well into what we started to discuss yesterday when we had more this solutions approach, but maybe a bit European centric, and now we really work on the shift to make this a fight against climate change also a fight for climate justice or for justice in general. And I think you capture this from so many great perspectives that, yeah, I get really emotional. Think about that we could now jointly work on this. And just again, for your information, this was recorded. So we have this morning reached the 300th registered participant, and we will make this available so that you can also share it with colleagues as kind of an online proceeding, because I think this needs to be heard, what you have presented. And I really want to encourage that we have this online format, allows us to easily share the talks, and not only the presentations, but the recorded talks. And as this conference is about connecting with fellow researchers, activists, civil society organizations, whoever joins, I make a brief announcement on what is coming next and how you can do these connections. So if you look at your conference platform, you have the tab Contacts. So here you can find different speakers. For example, from the morning session here, you would see Amro, and then you could write into the chat and say, "Hi Amro, great presentation." And so he will get this, and you can connect and maybe start some elaborating some ideas on how to work on climate justice in Alexandria, for example. So this is one thing I would like to encourage. And you see, it's it's working. Amro is online, so take advantage of this. And then for the program, we have now two break rooms. One is if you enjoy coffee, you can go to the RLI yurt, or if you enjoy tea, you can go to AGIA. You can learn more about these two organizations and what they're doing. It will be a little short, this break, because then we start already at 11:15 with a quite interactive session on dealing with climate depression. And I think this is, honestly, it is necessary, because when we've seen the picture of Alexandria, when we have seen yesterday keynote of Dan Cameron, which shows what level of efforts are necessary to reduce the emissions to keep the 1.5 degree target, it can sometimes feel as an overwhelming task. And we will speak in this session about dealing with climate depression. How can you work on this, and how can you translate this in a more optimistic view? So, which is, I think, necessary to really take the action. So this is what you can expect for the morning sessions. And then in the afternoon, we have these 4 parallel workshops. So you can just decide which one you want to join. So far, we have seen quite an equal distribution on preferences. So just be on time and join the workshop, and work actively on solutions for climate change and promoting climate justice. By that, I would like to close this wonderful session. I would like to thank Hanna for great moderation, and Mihir, Carolin, and Joan for their interesting presentation and talks. And see you all in the other sessions at the conference platform, or maybe one day in real life.